I think the big question is the cost of living crisis. There are things Labour could have done: rent controls, capping the increases that the water companies that have just put up water rates by 27% on average, the energy bills that have gone up, 3 times in the last year. There are a lot of things that they could do to ease the pressure on people, and they haven't done. Yes, there are things like the increase in the minimum wage. That's good. But of course, 2 million people are on the minimum wage. For the other 28 million, those just above it, or people on benefits, again, look at disability benefits. That's going to be another hit to Labour. I don't think you get political credit for doing something wrong, like cutting winter fuel payments and then going, actually, we're going to restore 75% of it a year later. It just makes you look incompetent.
Andrew, hello.
Hello.
How would you like to introduce yourself?
Based on reality.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm the former Executive Director of Policy for the Labour Party. I'm a columnist for the iPaper. And I'm a socialist, I guess.
And a regular contributor. Contributor?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've been with us a few times.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the spring statement, obviously. Just for those at the back, could you tell us the difference between... Sorry, I said spring statement. Yeah, no, that is correct. Can you tell us the difference between the spending review and the statement?
Okay, so the spring statement was a kind of update from the budget, and budget statements tend to kind of do annual tax changes, policy changes, that kind of thing. So they're kind of an annual thing, whereas a spending review tends to look ahead to the rest of the parliament and say, this is where we're going. Tends to be a lot more focused on capital investment. So we've got in the spending review today, no tax changes, really, no big policy changes, but a kind of a little bit more detail of where they're going to spend money and how much over 4 years in terms of capital spending. So that's investment, and on revenue spending, which is the day-to-day spending on things like the NHS, schools, social security for the next 3 years.
And we've had a big uptick in capital spending.
Yeah. By British standards, it's important to say. We've been the kind of lowest in the G7 for capital investment for the last 30 years at least. So we've kind of lagged behind everyone else in Europe, in North America, Canada, Japan, for a long, long time. And this is an uptick. It's a significant uptick by British standards, but it's still quite low.
So what's all that talk then about us being the Okay, I tell you what. Let's start with what Rachel Reeves trailed overnight, which was we're now in a better financial position than we were the last time that, the first time that she came to the dispatch box, and certainly she argues from the time that they won the election, which is puzzling to me because I think about September, and I believe it was the PwC who said we were the second most attractive place to invest, and they were very proud of that at the time. But apparently it was still a terrible economic situation, and it's much better now.
Yeah.
Do you feel that it is better now?
Well, it's a mixed bag. I don't think it's very clear cut in either direction. So you could look at it and say, in the short term, growth forecasts have been revised down. Over the longer 5-year period, they've been revised up very slightly, but it's margin of error stuff. On that, unemployment's gone up by about 100,000 since a year ago. Underemployment, which takes in people who are kind of working part-time but want to work full-time, people on temporary contracts who want a permanent job, people who, for whatever reason, can't claim unemployment benefits but are out of work and looking for work. That's gone up by about 500,000 in the last year.
But that's puzzling in itself, right? Because that's been a major focus for Liz Kendall and the Department for Work and Pensions.
Yeah, getting more people back to work. The part of the problem is the tax decision that Rachel Reeves made as Chancellor in her first budget, which was to increase employers' national insurance, which makes it basically more expensive to employ people. And if you're an employer and the economy isn't kind of growing ferociously, which it's not, the last quarter was very good, but the next quarter is expected to be not so good. You're going to look at that and think, do I want to hire now or do I delay my hiring decisions? If somebody leaves, do I replace them or do I wait and see how the economy turns out? And that's seemingly what's happened over the last sort of 6 months, really.
Really? So do you think that that's being felt already then, so that businesses are sort of wrapping themselves in
If you look at
preparation?
a lot of the business surveys, they're reporting that they are delaying hiring decisions or cancelling hiring decisions due to the fact that it's cost more to employ people. And that's a perfectly logical thing. basically employing people shouldn't be something you're taxing. It would have made a lot more sense economically, socially, for Rachel Reeves to have put up corporation tax, which is the tax companies pay on profits. Instead, she taxed employment, which is much easier to get because you can't really hide your employees. They pay tax. It goes through, PAYE for most people, and the HMRC, the Revenue and Customs, the Treasury sees it. So that's why she did it. And of course, in their manifesto, they promised not to raise corporation tax. They didn't make to a lot of people's minds, they did also make a pledge not to raise national insurance, but they were actually quite clear, I think, that that was for employees, not for employers. But it has an impact because, it makes it more expensive to employ you.
It's semantics, though, isn't it? It's like, because you didn't tax the working people, but by that argument, the bosses or the business owners aren't working people. It's
So
tricky
it's
syntax.
good not to put employees' national insurance up, but they have continued with the Tories' freeze on income tax threshold. So as your earnings go up, you pay more as a proportion of your income as tax, whereas that used to go up every year by inflation. So we're all getting dragged into paying a bit more tax, which is good for funding public services, bad for disposable income in the economy. And I think one of the big sort of things today is, yes, there's this money for capital spending. There's not really a lot on revenue day-to-day spending for public services, and there was absolutely nothing on the cost of living, for the money in people's pockets. In fact, if anything, there are sort of minor sort of cuts to people's incomes hidden in this spending review as well. So I don't think it's going to be this kind of great seismic change for the economy. There's some good investment decisions which may bear fruit years down the line, but in the here and now, it's probably not going to do Rachel Reeves a lot of good.
How do you think it's going to hit people's pockets?
Okay, so there are two things, I think. One is if you live in social housing, so in a council house or a housing association property, your rent is going to go up by inflation plus 1% for the next 10 years. That's part of the deal she's done with developers in order to create more housing. They'll be able to charge you more for your rent. So if your pay only goes up by inflation, but your rent goes up by inflation plus 1%, in real terms, you're worse off. So that's not good. It's good to create more housing. That isn't necessarily the way I would choose to fund it, or part fund it. And the second way that people are going to be hit, again, sleight of hand in this, there's a headline figure that she announced that, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government is going to get a 3.1% increase. When you drill down into that, you actually see that assumes council tax is going to go up by 5% every year. Now, inflation's currently about 3.4%, I think. So again, it's due to come down to sort of 2.5 by the end of the Parliament. So we're baked in above inflation council tax rises, which is a regressive tax. You pay more, if you're poorer relative to if you're richer. Not in absolute terms, of course, but relative to your income. So again, that's not very good for people's living standards either. So there was nothing kind of positive in that, in the spending review to kind of counteract either of those things either. So when you consider a lot of people are still finding it really tough, housing inflation is still at about 8%, housing costs, rental costs especially, are going up by about 8%. Mortgage rates are still relatively high compared with what we were used to for the last 15 years pre Liz Truss's wonderful budget.
And which is not likely to come down anytime soon. The Bank of England, when they're looking at the base rate, that's predicted to hold, right? The next time they look at that.
They've sort of, they were sounding quite bullish about a year ago, saying there'll be maybe 2 or 3 interest rates cuts this year. It looks like there'll only be 1 or 2 maybe at a push. So inflation's going to be a bit stickier than people had thought. Still not getting anywhere like the 10 or 11% we had under Rishi Sunak, but still higher than the Bank of England's mandate of 2%.
I found that some of the savings that were being listed were rather precarious. I mean, they were quite smoke and mirrors, because there was this one savings that she announced, which was about the asylum hotels, and she promised to end the use of asylum hotels by the end of this Parliament, and that was going to save £1 billion each year. I thought that was quite extraordinary to announce, because those people can't simply disappear. So to bake that in
No.
as a saving, that feels like a rather smoke and mirrors instrument.
I mean, part of the problem is the last Conservative government basically stopped processing people. It cut the resources within the Home Office to do that, and we got this huge backlog, which Labour inherited, of people kind of in limbo. I mean, you've had people who are asylum seekers spending over a year, sometimes up to 2 years, in hotels, which is not good or healthy for them as human beings, and obviously very costly for the taxpayer as
I'm
well.
in contact with someone
So-
who's in West London. He's been there for 4 years.
Wow. Okay, I mean, that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
But, there is a way to get that down. There are cost savings to be made there. I don't think it's incredible to kind of pledge to do that. Whether you can bank those savings that securely, obviously it depends as well on how many people come to the UK and claim asylum. I mean, at the moment, it's ticked up a little bit this year from last year, but 2023 was a bit higher. It's impossible to know. I mean, there are things we can do. Not cutting international aid would really help with fewer asylum seekers, for example. Not arming dictatorships would help with fewer people being displaced. Not bombing other countries. If you look at where people are coming from, they're countries where we've either propped up their dictatorships, armed them, or bombed those countries themselves. There are things we can do to reduce asylum, which are ethical, which are humane sort of ways of doing things. But just on a kind of functional, if you look at it from where Yvette Cooper's at, I think it is deliverable that you get the Home Office working and functioning a lot better, hire some more civil servants in the Home Office to process that backlog and reduce that. Because, I think if you look at a year ago's figures, which is the only practical ones you can look at, because then you've kind of gone through the appeals process as well, something between 60 and 75% of those asylum seekers are being found by the Home Office to be credible asylum seekers and granted leave to remain in some form. And therefore they can then go out and work, and they can earn money and pay rent in the private rented sector and so on, or perhaps if they're on low incomes, with a bit of housing benefit to top it up like the rest of us. So there is a kind of way of doing that that does reduce that in a decent way, but let's see.
Should we talk about housing? Because I think it was sort of billed overnight that Angela Rayner was one of the big winners.
Yeah.
Having received a slight uptick. But then looking at the actual document, it seemed that actually there was a 1% decrease in her department.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point I was getting at with the council tax thing. It's built in a 5% increase. I mean, the capital spending, again, so separating revenue spending, which is local authority spending predominantly, and capital spending, which is the housing element of it mainly, is important. But if you look at, I think they've said 39 billion on affordable housing, which, let's face it, isn't really affordable. It's 80% of market rate, which to probably 80% of people still isn't affordable, right?
Yeah.
So that's an issue. The split between that and social housing and council housing is a really important thing to kind of get the numbers on eventually when we do see that. And we haven't got that detail as far as I'm aware at this stage. But even that kind of big headline figure, which is a victory, is still lower than the last Labour government was spending, from 97 to 2010 on housing. So it's not that big a victory. I mean, yay, it's better than the Tories were doing, and it's a significant increase on what the Tories were doing, but it's still not anywhere kind of close to the need we've got in this country. I mean, we've got record levels of families in temporary accommodation at the moment. More children than ever spent last Christmas in a home that they couldn't call their own. And that's bad socially, it's bad economically, it's bad, a whole range of social outcomes if people are left in temporary accommodation for a long time.
Well,
So,
absolutely. I mean, leaving the morality aside, the landlords that are renting these back to local authorities, they're charging above, some of them, most of them, are charging above market rates back to the local authority.
And that's, causing the financial pressures on local government. I mean, in places like where I live in Croydon, it's a huge part of the cost of councils. I mean, councils predominantly are struggling because of social care and temporary accommodation, and to some extent children's services as well. Those are the three big pressures on councils, and the funding settlement for councils without a 5% increase in council tax is actually a cut. So it's not a good overall. If I was Angela Rayner, I wouldn't be very happy. And there were rumours of there being quite big bust ups. The capital spending on housing,
Furious.
is good stuff, right? But it's again, we need to see the breakdown in terms of what's, affordable housing, what's housing association, and what's council housing. And it does come with that sting in the tail of, if you are a tenant in housing association or council, your rent is going up above inflation for the next 10 years.
The sort of the prevailing line across broadcast today has been, I hate this phrase, there's no jam tomorrow. We're looking at long-term projects here that people won't feel the benefit of. When you were putting together policy, is that something that concerned you? Did you feel that you needed to entice voters, or were you looking at more of a long-term infrastructure strategy?
I think you've got to do both. And I think for this Labour government and where it is politically, and we can get into the politics of it as well, not just the economics, they've got to do something in the here and now to make people warm to them. Saying there be an airport or a tram network in your city by 2035, great. Okay, how does that help me today? I mean, it's good in terms of creating jobs. Obviously, it's good in the long term. I'm not knocking it. What I'm saying is it's not enough on its own. And I think the big question is the cost of living crisis. There are things Labour could have done, rent controls, capping the increases that the water companies that have just put up water rates by 27% on average, I think at 49% in Southern Water. The energy bills that have gone up, 3 times in the last year. There are a lot of things that they could do to ease the pressure on people, kind of take on the corporations, position themselves in that way as if like we're on your side, and they haven't done. Yes, there are things like the increase in the minimum wage. That's good. But of course, 2 million people are on the minimum wage. For the other 28 million, those just above it, or people on benefits, again, look at disability benefits. That's going to be another hit to Labour. I don't think you get political credit for doing something wrong, like cutting winter fuel payments and then going, actually, we're going to restore 75% of it a year later. It just makes you look incompetent, really, because this idea, I mean, they said at the time, I think it was one of the government ministers said, there'll be a run on the pound if we don't do this. But, we've just restored 75% of it. Has there been a run on the pound? No, of course not.
Yeah.
And as we were saying at the beginning, the economy has not fundamentally got a lot better since that point. Hasn't got fundamentally worse either, but it's kind of where it was. And it's, I think it's a bit silly to have said that. More than a bit silly, actually, it's ridiculous.
No,
to have said that, but
I am honestly actually astounded that the decision of the line, which was we're in a fiscally better position now. We couldn't afford to do it, and now we can. I mean, nothing's changed. If anything, you could make the argument that actually the US tariffs have wiped out every bit of headroom that was clawed back, or I don't know, fictionally clawed back by Rachel Reeves during that period. You could make an argument that we're in a worse position.
I think we're in a very unstable world, and it's very unpredictable at the moment. And whilst we did have the fastest rate of growth in the first quarter of this year, every forecast, including the government's own ones from the OBR, is that that's going to kind of shrink to virtually nothing for the rest of the year, or be fairly kind of perfunctory, kind of 0.2%, that sort of thing per quarter, which isn't going to boost the economy. So I think there are real, and some of it's self-inflicted. As I said, I think the cut to employers' national insurance hasn't helped. I think the fact that a lot of people aren't feeling better off, or the wage rises that have been there, the real terms wage rises, have been absorbed by real terms increases in energy bills, in water bills, in rent, and everything else. Rail fares, bus fares. The bus cap went up in most of the country, obviously not here in London, but for everyone else.
That cost is subsidised. That I always find really interesting, because it's something that Andy Burnham and Sadiq Khan have taken on within their own budgets, right?
Yeah.
They've absorbed the cost in their local government authority budgets, and not every area can do that. I mean, you've got two devolved powers there who actually do have control of a rather large budget,
and have probably the two best networks in the country as well. London
absolutely.
And
and you look at Birmingham right now, and I was looking just this morning that Birmingham have cut all of their library opening times to just Saturdays because the council is broke.
Yeah.
They can't absorb the cost of transport. They can't.
I mean, and that's true. And I think people are kind of still experiencing that. I mean, in the last year, my council, which is a Tory-run authority in South London, has closed 4 libraries. And when we're talking about social mobility and trying to lift children's aspirations, closing 4 libraries isn't very good. It's not good for elderly people who also rely on those sort of public services, particularly. So it's I think people are still seeing that their local infrastructure is kind of shrinking. It's hard to get a GP appointment still. It's hard to get social care if you've got a loved one. The NHS has still got massive backlogs. And actually, the increase in the NHS, which has got this kind of big headline figure, 3% for the NHS, 2.8% actually for health and social care overall. It's really small, actually, in terms of what the NHS needs. The NHS workforce plan, which was the 10-year kind of projection that came out under the last Conservative government that both Labour and the Tories signed up to, envisaged 3.6% annual increases in the NHS budget. And they've given 3%, arguably 2.8, but 3% in the spending review. And you just think, well, that's below what it needs to kind of stand still, really.
Does it need to be around 4%?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, the last Labour government increased the NHS by about 6% a year after years of decline under the last Tory government. Now, obviously, Labour has inherited a worse economy than that Labour government did in 1997, and it's tougher. But you've got to get out there and make the argument for tax increases or whatever. You can do things, I think, that they haven't done, and they've been very cautious, and they're paying the price. I mean, in some ways, they must be incredibly grateful that the Tories, and again, we're getting into the politics rather than the economics, that the Tories are so crap at the moment, frankly,
Yeah.
and that Reform even have got their own kind of imploding aspects to them, the kind of soap opera within them. I think they could be a lot worse off if their opposition was a lot more competent.
Well, you brought them up, not me. And so we'll continue. There was a real obsession with Reform, I thought, during her time at the Dispatch box today. She name-checked Reform and Nigel, I think 2 or 3 times, but there were other policies as well. I mean, she name-checked them when she argued that Nigel was still itching to replicate a trust-style budget. I thought it was a bit of an unnecessary jibe at him. Not an unnecessary jibe, but an unnecessary mention. Then she was talking about allocating £118 million to keep coal tips safe in Wales. Now, Nigel was in Port Talbot on Monday, and he was talking about coal tips, bizarrely, and the dangers of coal tips. And I just thought, my God, have you allocated that cash because of that press conference? And then she was talking about a zero-based review, this line-by-line assessment of what government spends. And it's the first time, apparently, 18 years that they've ever done it. Thought that was quite similar to the Reform Doge pitch, And then at the end again, she was talking about the NHS, how she would never want to see it privatised, but Nigel Farage would. I mean, that sort of deep obsession with reform, I find that politically strange, because it's sort of like, I don't really understand the jibes when what you could do is introduce taxes that make working people's lives a bit better.
Yes, but in the absence of that, you have to kind of do parliamentary knockabout, don't you?
Okay.
And I guess, and that's the point. I mean, I think you've kind of answered your own question, is that they are rattled. The next set of elections are unlike the ones we've just had in May. Next May in 2026, are predominantly Labour-held seats, and Reform are coming for them. I mean, Reform are ahead of Labour in Wales in the opinion polls at the moment. They're in second and Labour's in third, and Plaid are looking like they're going to win it at the moment. Things can obviously change a lot in the next year. And, there are risks that Reform will get footholds in areas where the Tories didn't and haven't. And Labour is just not very popular. And there are also, I think, bigger risks for Labour, that their vote stays at home, goes to the Lib Dems, the Greens in more urban seats as well. So they've got to start thinking about that as well. The best way to always counter your opponents is to do something good yourself and focus on that. So, yeah. But again, in the absence of that, they're going to keep doing these little jobs. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to remind the public things that Nigel Farage said about it as the best Tory budget in 20 years, or whatever he said about Liz Truss's budget. It's fine to kind of drop that in as a thing. But you're right, she kept coming back to it. It wasn't just one job. There was the joke about the pubs in Westminster, which is a very Westminster insidery type sort of.
Spent too much time at the Westminster Arms.
It should be the 2 chairmen. Boom, boom, because they've had their problems with that. Which I didn't think was a bad joke, but it's a bit beneath the Chancellor, I think. And also, for anyone who hasn't worked in and around Westminster, you've got no idea what the pubs are called in SW1. So it's a bit
odd. If we're going to go really insider as well, I don't actually think he spends that much time there. I think he's actually more around the corner. He spends a bit more time in St James.
Right. Okay.
So if we're
Well, I'm not that insidery anymore, so I don't know
But
Farage drinks. I mean, I see he's in New York and Washington quite a lot, actually. More so than Clacton, one could argue. But there we are.
Yes. Let's go back a bit to what you were saying at the beginning about corporation tax, because that was really interesting. I can't remember that there wasn't any chatter. It was in the manifesto, wasn't it, that they weren't going to raise corporation tax, but there were hints at them going after carried interest and capital gains tax.
Yeah.
That seems to have vanished off the agenda.
Well, they did. I mean, they've kind of watered it down. It's sort of a homeopathic version of those things, I guess. The carried interest, they got lobbied by private equity, and they've kind of rolled back on it quite a lot. And that's, unfortunate. Disabled people can't buy tickets for Rachel Reeves to concerts, and they don't get this kind of access, so they can't lobby her to water down the cuts for them.
And I'm sure they can. I mean, those PIP payments are just,
I mean, they're obviously all swinging the lead as well, I mean, so yeah, I mean, it's grim stuff, and it doesn't look good, I think, when you water down tax cuts on incredibly rich people and you go, actually, the disabled people can pay it.
Yeah.
They're on, a few £1,000s a year, mostly in poverty still, because benefits in this country are incredibly low in real terms. And also, the other thing with PIP, which I think is really under discussed, and I know this is a bit of a diversion, I'll get back to the other point, is that it's a benefit payment to people with disabilities. It's what enables many disabled people to work. Yeah. So by cutting that, you're actually probably going to kick some disabled people out of work because they will no longer get the support that enables them to get up and go to work in the morning. That's the perversity of it. So, the other tax on capital gains, they did a really modest uptick in capital gains. But what we should be doing, and look, Nigel Lawson did this in the 80s, it's not radical socialism to do it, is equalise income tax with capital gains, because we have the, I think, absurd situation at the moment where you go out and work for a living, you work long hours, you pay 20% of income tax, or 40% if you're lucky enough to earn over 50,000-ish. And yet if you make your money by selling properties or trading shares or whatever, you pay far, far lower rates of tax. And you just think, this isn't healthy job creating kind of work. It's not benefiting anyone except those people. It ought to be taxed at the same rate, at least, I would argue, as income tax. It also means if you're a business owner, there is the perverse incentive, and I'm not accusing any of them of doing this, but there is the perverse incentive to go, do you know what, I'm going to book that as a capital gain rather than pay myself an income, because I pay a lower rate of tax on that than I would if I paid myself an income.
Financial advice with Andrew Fisher.
Yeah, I'm not encouraging people to do that, but that is that. I mean, and that's predominantly why a Tory chancellor did that.
Yeah.
And people, if you put people in situations where it's like, oh, if you just do this, and it gives financial advisors a great opportunity to go, look, you can do that and save a load of money and pay me a commission.
Yeah.
Which I don't think makes a productive economy.
It's bizarre, isn't it? Because there does seem to be huge public outcry for a wealth tax. And it's almost, I feel like wealth tax is almost becoming like, I worry that the phrase is becoming redundant because it's being repeated so often.
Yeah. And people mean different things by wealth taxes as well, by wealth tax.
I'm kind of the Neil Duncan Jordan school of thought, which is like the wealth tax is like a tax on assets over 10 million. I would argue wouldn't affect
many people.
that many people. No. It's so interesting because it was like corporation tax is something that is not paid by, people with millionaires, people who are turning over millions and millions because they offshore their businesses, but it is paid by people who you could argue are quote unquote working people. And so when Nigel Farage is talking about how I want to lower corporation tax and I want to incentivize people to start their businesses here. Yeah. And then,
But that just to pick up on Nigel Farage's argument, it's not true. Look, we have the lowest rate of corporation tax in the G7. If people were thinking, where shall I cite my business because of corporation tax, they'd all be flooding to the UK, leaving the US, Japan, France, Germany, but they're not, because businesses also value other things. They need an educated workforce, which means good skills training, which we haven't got. They need kind of good infrastructure, transport infrastructure that works. They want a health service that works as well, that hasn't got massive backlogs. All of those things are part of the equation as well. Maybe they look at employers' national insurance as well and think, that's an added cost that's hidden a bit. So there are other things you can do. I personally would raise corporation tax, you could put it back to where it was, midway through the last Tory government, where it was 28%. That's fine. It would still put us about in the middle of the G7, probably slightly at the lower end still, and you'd raise billions of pounds that way without really you're not hitting companies that are struggling, who aren't making much of a profit, because you only pay it on your profits. Plus, you do need to clamp down on those companies, normally the larger ones, who will shift their income between different international bases in order to reduce their tax take. So I think there's a lot more of that kind of thing. I mean, inheritance tax, which is indeed a wealth tax, it's a huge area where there are massive loopholes. I mean, the Duke of Westminster is the kind of poster child for reforming inheritance tax, where, billions and billions of pounds in tax were avoided because of the loopholes that exist there. And, people who are, perhaps left a kind of, medium-sized family home, certainly in London or the South East, are paying inheritance tax and can't avoid it because it's, they haven't planned for that and they're not really thinking like that. But the mega rich are doing it and are avoiding inheritance tax pretty much, uniformly. And there is billions to be raised there.
I really am of the school of thought that I do not buy that if you raise corporation tax, businesses will leave. Because you think about, how expensive it is to rent an office space in London, right? And many businesses do, because they like the prestige, and people like to go to the restaurants here, and people like the schools here, and they like the area. That is a cost that a business will bake in, and will be happy to pay. If they're happy to pay the extortionate London rental, battle the rental market here for an office, I think they'll pay a couple of extra % on corporation tax. Well, we put the world to right there. Is there anything else in particular that you'd like to talk about from the spending review?
I think the worry about the capital spending part of it that I have, the other worry, apart from it's a welcome uptick, and I'll couch my remarks by saying that, but it's still not on the scale we need, is that then you've got to look at, well, who's going to build all this stuff? Who are the people who are going to build it? Because yes, we have rising unemployment, but they're not necessarily trained builders, carpenters, plumbers, engineers, the people that we need to have this massive kind of uptick in this. We've got energy projects, we've got housing projects, school restoration. There was some money allocated for that, a little bit on the NHS, although really not much actually, which worries me. Is there the skill strategy to go alongside this? Are we training more plumbers, technicians, engineers, and so on? And the education budget got a 1.5% increase. That's pretty modest. That's not the kind of transformational, here's this raft of money for training the next generation of, of people who are going to build new infrastructure. So there is a worry about that. At the same time as falling migration as well. They have made this pledge that they're going to cut net migration. And you just think, so we're not going to import already skilled workers. We're not really putting enough into training our own people. Is there going to come a point, and I say it as a question, because I haven't looked into it in enough detail to be sure of it, but my worry would be, if you really are kind of doing this big expansion of housing, energy, school rebuilding, etc., have we got the workforce to do it? And I'm not convinced the answer is yes. And maybe they've looked at it, maybe I'm being pessimistic, but that would be a big concern of mine.
That has been a prevailing worry for quite some time now, right? We were warning about it post-Brexit. Well, we weren't, but, Joe wasn't, but people were. But on your point about education there, I wonder if that includes, because today Reeves was talking about how children should not be learning in temporary buildings in schools, and that there was going to be I've forgotten the word, doing the schools up. What am I looking
kind
for?
of school restoration.
That's it,
I don't know, yeah.
And I wonder, is that going to come out of that education fund? Because that feels like a very expensive undertaking.
That's capital funding, so it is allocated separately.
Okay.
And that did get a decent boost. The day-to-day spending on education, which funds things like adult education, further education, higher education, schools, has got quite a low increase. Now, some people would argue, well, actually, if you look at the demographics, the school numbers are falling slightly, only marginally, compared with the last 5 years, and therefore you can afford to fund it a bit less and protect per pupil funding. But the problem is we need a massive expansion in skills training. And also, if you're going to get millions of disabled people back to work, as they promise, obviously is not going to happen. They're just going to put them into poverty and put them on lower benefits effectively if they get their cuts through, you're going to need skills training for that, right? So it really, really worries me, all this stuff about the lack of kind of joined up thinking within government. And, you know, there is an argument that says, do you know what, we're going to make it much more attractive to come here, migration, etc. But politically, they're kind of running scared of that, and they've accepted the fact that even though net migration has fallen now for 2 years in a row and is forecast to fall more sharply, they're not kind of going, do you know what, we've still got massive backlog in the NHS, we've still got 137,000 vacancies, I think, in social care, we still haven't got enough people to build the homes we need. Maybe we ought to welcome some migration to fix that. But it seems to me neither Rachel Reeves nor Keir Starmer have got the political skills, capability, confidence, call it what you will, to kind of get up in front of the public and go, do you know what, we have to accept higher migration, or we have to accept higher taxes, or any kind of controversial thing that I think you can win an argument on if you make it honestly, repeatedly, explain the world as it is. And instead, we've kind of got this myth making that we can cut migration, we can cut your taxes, you can have world-class public services, we can invest in things, and we can also cut, benefits for poor people, and there'll be no bad consequences to that. I mean, it's not really thought through. And I still think there's a kind of, and it's not just Labour, the last Tory government were far worse for it, there's this kind of irreality about British politics at the moment where there is kind of, and look at the mess we're in as a country, kind of low growth for 15, 20 years now, declining public services in many areas. And, I don't feel there's a kind of political force at the moment that is kind of making an honest, upfront, confident argument, and hasn't been for the last 10 years, I'm afraid.
They've lost the run of the argument.
I don't think they've even tried making it. That's what's worrying.
Right.
And I'm not sure they've got the skills, confidence, whatever it is, to do it.
I don't think I can't imagine Keir Starmer selling that very well on migration, to be honest.
No, and I don't like to get personal about these things because it's about the policies, but you also have to sell the policies as well, and they haven't got the policies, and from what you see of them day to day, they're not the best communicators in the world, aren't they?
Well, on that note, hopefully we were
joyful, isn't it?
Yeah. If you enjoyed it, let us know on the Reddit. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.